At age 72, I have never used a PowerPoint, and I'm not starting now. George Mumford did a wonderful job, and he's got an extraordinary reputation. And these little letters come creeping across the screen, and I'm saying, my God, this could have been me. So check with me when I'm 100 and I'm out of touch, and maybe I'll do a PowerPoint at that time. So George labeled himself recovering, and I'm a recovering journalist. I was a paid skeptic for 35 years at 7 newspapers. But I want you to know there's a big difference between being a paid skeptic and a cynic. And the truth to tell, I'm as idealistic as I was when I was 15 years old. And just to get stunningly corny with you. And those of you who have grown-up children will know what I'm speaking about. I have 5 children. I've been married for 50 years. I love my wife more than when we were married 50 years ago, and I loved her then, I promise you. And our children are ages 50 to 29, and I frequently say I'm only as happy as my unhappiest child. And if you have grown-up children, you know what I mean, because turns out they grow up, they have adult problems like the rest of us. So I'm a deeply blessed human being. I told you I was a skeptic, and I still am, and I think it's healthy in the Republic. And the truth to tell, I'm somebody who came at mindfulness with a deep skepticism. To be honest, it seemed a little too warm and fuzzy for me. And I wondered, could it really make any difference? And until 4 years ago, I'd never even heard of mindfulness. And then I sat around across the table at a benefit at Joe's for Foster Care Review, and the person across the table was Valerie York Zimmerman, and there is no doubt in my mind that she welcomed the hour-and-a-half chance to convert me on the subject. And so she makes this great pitch. And I came away thinking it was an intriguing concept, and that she was a person of vigorous caring and a compassionate proponent, but to be honest, back then it didn't seem practical enough. And so she follows up with a boatload of information. And I read it all, and a couple of years pass, and she hornswoggles me into, hornswoggle being an Old West term, you remember this? I think they did it to cattle or rustlers or something, I don't know. So she hornswoggles me into a gathering at this university. And the speaker was a member of the United States Congress named Tim Ryan, who had written a book and has written a book about making the case for mindfulness. And I listened to the presentation that day, heard some of the research, was impressed with it, bought the book, subsequently bought copies for others, and I was clearly on the way to being snagged. And then I kept seeing stories. I would see stories in the Herald, for example, on mindfulness awareness for law students and football players, and I can remember a New York Times story on mindfulness training in the military and mindfulness's relationship to technology. And I've come to the point where I almost literally now hear about mindfulness everywhere. Literally a week ago, I was walking the legendary El Camino Trail in northern Spain. And my companions were Mike and Constance Fernandez. And it turns out that Constance had a huge interest in mindfulness. And then one evening, somewhere in northern Spain, we had dinner with a couple from Colombia. And the conversation turns to mindfulness, and it turns out that Carolina Saravia trains teachers in Bogota in mindfulness. So if you wonder whether our time, your time is coming, and maybe has come, it is. Today I find myself convinced and converted. Don't make this into too spiritual a thing at this moment, okay? It's not as though Pope Francis has come to me personally to make the case for mindfulness. Though he would be convincing. He is the best news the Catholic Church has had in my lifetime, in my estimation. But I've come away convinced that mindfulness speaks to the people we want to be and the community we want to be, and frankly, the country we want or should want to be. And if it weren't for Valerie York Zimmerman, I promise you that not only would I not be here today, but I would be far more ignorant and far less enlightened. So Valerie, we all owe you a lot of thanks. Thank you. Some of you know that most of the time I focus on the earliest years for children because those are the most important learning years of your life. And if we ever got smart about those years, we would make a sea change in the future of our country. I build my work on the basis that 85% of brain growth occurs by the age of 3, on the fact that 30% of children start school behind and then most of them get further behind. And the research that tells us that if you have 100 children at the end of first grade who are poor readers, by the end of fourth grade, 88 of the 100 remain poor readers. That's how powerful the early years are. I'm not going to focus, of course, on early learning today, but I want you to know that I think that mindfulness connects directly to the work in which I'm engaged. I believe that a real movement in the early childhood years can be done only if we are thinking about embracing all children. Because in fact, the exact same principles that raised my children are the exact same principles that raise everyone else's child. The right blend of health and education and nurturing and love. And believing in all children, we help all of us. It makes sense, practical, economic, and moral. Makes sense to be mindful of how everyone is doing and to give every child the opportunity to fulfill his or her potential. You and I want to live in safe and secure neighborhoods. We want people to grow up to own homes and cars and participate in the democracy of this republic. And if we want those things, then we ought to know the quite extraordinary evidence of the power of early investment and the power to grow children who dream and have a real chance to achieve those dreams. So despite the progress you and we have made in the matter of mindfulness, we're a long way from being where we need to be in capturing the full spirit. In my more perfect world, every single principal would be trained in mindfulness, and with that training done well and a principal came away convinced and owning mindfulness, then he or she would be eager to make this a central theme with everyone at that school. Teachers would be empowered to use mindfulness in their lives, and the lives of their students would be significantly better. Mindfulness speaks to me, to a focused mind, to academic and all your life achievements, to social, emotional, and spiritual growth, to peace, to less anxiety and stress, and people who feel better about themselves and people who feel better about other people. What great gifts those would be. You already heard this morning from the superintendent, a man I admire and someone from whom I can learn much. But I missed his presentation because even before this invitation to speak, I had committed to speak to an opening session of Leadership Miami held by the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce. So I'm going to assume you heard a full focus on education from Alberto Carvalho, the nation's literally most celebrated school superintendent. So I want to give you a somewhat different perspective on mindfulness and what I think it means for the future of Miami and America. And I'll do this in the straightest way possible, calling upon what my favorite president, Mr. Lincoln, called, quote, the better angels of our nature. And I want you to take my word for it that I am a fully centrist American. I'm not a radical of any sort, but I am eager for us to live up to the highest promises of our beloved country. And so in that spirit, I have come to think that mindfulness at its soul helps us to be better people, and that surely we have within us the power to be such. But I ask you a series of questions, and I ask myself. I ask all of us, how can it be? How can it be that the United States has a greater wealth gap by race than South Africa did during apartheid? How can it be that we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the prisoners? How can it be that almost a quarter of our children in this greatest, most generous country in the history of the world live in the full federal definition of poverty? How can it be when Mother Teresa, after visiting this country and noting she had never seen such an abundance of things, goes on to say that she had never seen, quote, such a poverty of the spirit, of loneliness, and of being unwanted? How can it be that Florida spends less than $2,500 for a 4-year-old pre-K slot and less than $7,000 for a public school slot and $51,000 to incarcerate a juvenile? How can it be that our country is the only developed nation in the world without paid maternity leave? How can it be that 3 out of every 4 American 4-year-olds, American 17 to 24-year-olds cannot enter the American military, have a substance abuse problem, a criminal justice problem, an academic problem, or a physical problem? And surely this must be a matter of our national security. How could it possibly be that we are among only 3 of 34 advanced nations whose schools serving higher income students have more funding per pupil and lower student-teacher ratios than do schools serving poor students? And how can it be that the aggregated resources of the 85 wealthiest people in the world amount to the same total wealth as 3.5 billion people, or half the population of the world? And how can it be that we can spend $1.5 trillion to bring democracy to Afghanistan and Iraq, and we cannot do right by our own children? We are surely a better people than this. I want to take a different tack. You are going to hear your first ever speech ever that uses passenger pigeons as a metaphor. My mind on mindfulness applies to all living creatures. In the spirit of what the world-famous primatologist Jane Goodall had to say, quote, how terribly arrogant we have become because of mistaken belief that man has domination over the birds of the air and the fishes of the sea. And she goes on to say the word dominion was actually a translation of the Hebrew word stewardship, which means to care for. And so I was struck by this recent headline in the New York Times, quote, "Has the passing of the passenger pigeon taught us anything?" Just 100 years ago, this very month, Martha died in her cage in the Cincinnati Zoo. She was the last of the breed. A bird population once so populous that flocks of an estimated 2 billion birds would darken the skies for days in 19th century America. And for many years, for some reason, the fate of the passenger pigeon has intrigued me, come close to almost tormenting me. In my home, you will find bound volumes of a magazine called St. Nicholas Magazine, long gone, but a children's treat for a good chunk of the 19th and 20th centuries. And if I go to an issue that I have at home from 1873, a time when tens of millions of passenger pigeons still shadowed the sky, the writer in that piece talks about seeing overhead, quote, "a multitude of travelers who could no more be numbered than the sands upon the seashore." And she goes on to write, "When the young pigeons are almost ready to fly, comes the exciting time known as robbing the roost. Men arm themselves with long poles with which they upset the nests. The poor squabs fall to the ground and are easily caught in large quantities. They can then be kept in cages, fattened and killed as they are wanted." And she says, "So many of these birds are killed every year that it seems as if they must gradually disappear. But they multiply so very fast. And Audubon thought that nothing but the destruction of our forests could lessen their number." And today, ladies and gentlemen, they're all gone. Every single one of them. And we're the poorer for that. And is this any way to treat living creatures? Are we not a smarter, better, wiser people than to let such happen during our human watch? Some of you are old enough to remember Walt Kelly's comic strip character, Pogo, who said famously, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." Amen. The joy of my life, in the same fashion George Mumford expressed so well, is trying to do good, to live, to learn, to give. Mark Twain once said, "The two most important days in your life are the day you were born and the day you figure out why." And mindfulness, it seems to me, helps us figure out why. In this audience today are so many of the people that Peggy Noonan, the former presidential speechwriter and now Wall Street Journal columnist, had in mind when she wrote, quote, "In a way, the world is a great liar. It shows you it worships and admires money, but at the end of the day, it does not. It says it adores fame and celebrity, but it really doesn't. The world admires and wants to hold on to and not lose goodness. It admires virtue. At the end, it gives its greatest tributes to generosity, honesty, courage, mercy, talents well used, talents that brought into the world make it better. And that's what we talk about in eulogies," she wrote, "because that's what's important. We don't say the thing about Joe was that he was rich. We say, if we can, the thing about Joe was that he took care of people." Or listen to these words from Anne Frank, whose life and meaning have stayed with me for decades. "In the deepest, darkest days of the Holocaust, a time she would not endure, she wrote, quote, 'How wonderful it is that nobody waited a single moment before starting to improve the world.' And I am so very sure that mindfulness lived in the heart and the soul of Anne Frank. she found through mindfulness some measure of peace amidst the horrors of the Holocaust. I quote finally Albert Einstein, quote, "The ideals that have lighted my way in time after time have given me new courage to face life cheerfully, have been kindness, beauty, and truth," which says it well. You're being mindful of what is truly important in this world and what is important in the next. Nurtures my optimistic, idealistic, practical, and mindful soul. Thank you, and God bless you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.